They told a tribe of people in the Venezuelan rainforest that they were the ones who killed Jesus. The Panare, a quiet, peaceful people who had lived deep in the jungle for hundreds of years, who had never heard of Jesus, who had never read a single word of the Bible, and now there was a book, translated into their own language, telling them that their ancestors had hammered nails into the hands of God's Son, that they had dragged him to a cross and murdered him. And according to the story that has spread across the internet, across universities, across documentaries and academic papers, the missionaries did this on purpose. They rewrote the Bible. They changed the story deliberately, swapping out the Romans and the Jewish leaders for the Panare people, so that an entire tribe would feel so crushing a guilt that they would have no choice but to accept Christianity. That is what millions of people believe happened. And the question you need to ask yourself right now is any of it actually true? Before we get into what is real and what is not, you need to understand something about how this story spread. It started in an academic paper, written by a credible linguist, published in a real journal. The man's name was Daniel Everett. You may have heard of him. He would later become one of the most controversial figures in the world of linguistics, famous for his work with a different Amazon tribe called the Pirahã. But before all of that, in the 1970s, Everett was himself a missionary. He was sent to the rainforest to convert indigenous people. And years later, after he had left Christianity entirely and become an atheist, he began to describe what he had witnessed. The story of the Panare and their translated Bible was one of the things he talked about, and once it was out, it spread fast. The version that most people heard went something like this. A group of American evangelical missionaries, working under an organization called the New Tribes Mission, made contact with the Panare people sometime in the mid-20th century. The Panare lived in the Orinoco Basin region of Venezuela, a vast and remote stretch of tropical forest in the south of the country. They were a small group, never numbering more than a few thousand people, and they had maintained their own language, their own customs, their own spiritual beliefs for centuries, without significant outside interference. When the missionaries arrived, they faced a problem that every missionary faces when they go to a culture that has no previous contact with Christianity. How do you explain concepts like sin, guilt, salvation, and crucifixion to people who have no framework for any of it? The answer the missionaries supposedly came up with was brutal in its simplicity. They made the story personal. They made the Panare the killers. The specific text that became infamous was a translated passage that read, according to the version that circulated widely, something along the lines of, "The Panare killed Jesus Christ." And then it went further, describing how the Panare people themselves performed the acts of the crucifixion. They carried the cross. They drove the nails. They were responsible. Scholars and activists who read this were horrified. Here was a colonizing religion not just arriving in an indigenous community, but psychologically weaponizing guilt to force conversion. It was described as spiritual violence. It was held up as a textbook example of how missionary activity could be used to destroy a culture from the inside, replacing the indigenous worldview with a profound sense of inherited shame. The story was repeated in classrooms. It was cited in papers on missionary ethics. It became a symbol of everything critics believed was wrong with religious conversion of indigenous peoples. And here is the thing. That criticism, in the broadest sense, is not unfounded. The history of missionary contact with indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific is genuinely dark. Languages have been suppressed. Ceremonies have been banned. Children have been taken from families. Cultures have been dismantled with breathtaking speed by people who were absolutely convinced they were doing God's work. The damage is real, documented, and ongoing. So, when the story of the Panare Bible appeared, it landed in a context where it felt completely believable. It confirmed what many people already suspected. Of course, missionaries would do something like this. Of course, they would rewrite scripture to make indigenous people feel guilty. It fit the pattern, and that is exactly why it is worth looking more carefully at whether this specific story is actually true. Let's talk about who the Panare people actually are, because they have often been reduced to a footnote in someone else's argument, and they deserve more than that. The Panare, who refer to themselves as Enyapa Woromaipu, meaning roughly the people of this place, are an indigenous group native to the Bolivar state of Venezuela, a region of dense tropical forest and river systems in the south of the country. Their population has historically been small, a few thousand at most, and they have traditionally lived in small communities spread across a wide territory. They are hunters and farmers, skilled at navigating their environment, with a rich oral tradition and a complex system of social relationships. They are not, and have never been, a primitive or simple people, despite the way they are sometimes portrayed in stories about missionary contact. They had a complete and functioning civilization long before anyone came to convert them. The New Tribes Mission, the organization that sent missionaries to the Panare, was founded in 1942 in the United States. Its stated goal was to reach what it called unreached tribal peoples with the Christian gospel. It was an evangelical organization with a very specific theological mission: to translate the Bible into the native languages of indigenous peoples and to establish Christian churches within those communities. This was and continues to be a deeply controversial enterprise. Critics argue that it is a form of cultural imperialism, that it destroys indigenous belief systems in the name of a foreign religion, and that the very act of translation is never neutral. When you take a religious text and move it from one language into another, you are not just swapping words. You are making choices about meaning, about emphasis, about which concepts get mapped onto which other concepts, and those choices can shape how a community understands itself and its place in the world. This is where the story of the Panare Bible gets complicated in ways that most of the viral versions never bother to explain. Because there is a difference between saying that missionaries rewrote the Bible to deliberately blame an indigenous tribe for the death of Jesus, and saying that a translated text contained culturally adapted language that, when read in a certain way, implicated the local people in the crucifixion story. The first is a calculated act of manipulation. The second is something more ambiguous, and arguably more common than most people realize. Translation always involves interpretation. When missionaries work in a language that has no word for guilt, no word for sin, no word for sacrifice in the Christian sense, they have to find equivalents. They have to build bridges between ideas. And sometimes those bridges collapse in ways the translator never intended, or sometimes they hold in ways that the translator intended very deliberately. Knowing which one happened here matters. So what does the evidence actually show? This is where things get significantly more complicated than the viral story suggests. Researchers who have looked carefully at the translated Panare texts have found something that does not match the dramatic narrative that circulates online. The translated materials do appear to have used local framing and local imagery to tell the story of the crucifixion. That is consistent with how Bible translation often works, particularly in evangelical missionary contexts, where making the text feel immediate and relevant to the reader is considered essential. But the claim that the text explicitly and deliberately recast the Panare people themselves as the murderers of Jesus in a calculated act of psychological manipulation is a far stronger claim, and the evidence for it is shakier than most people realize. Daniel Everett, who is the person most associated with spreading this story, has himself been questioned about the specific details. Everett was a brilliant and genuinely important figure in linguistics, but he was also someone with a strong personal narrative about his disillusionment with missionary work. His account of the Panare Bible was part of a broader story he was telling about the corruption and harm of missionary activity. That does not mean he was lying. It means his account needs to be read in context, with the understanding that memory, interpretation, and personal conviction all shape the stories we tell, even when we are trying to be honest. Other scholars who examined the actual translated documents found that the picture was more nuanced, that some passages used inclusive language that drew the reader into the crucifixion narrative, which is actually a common literary and theological device, not an act of ethnic blame. Think about how the crucifixion story is told in many churches across the world right now. It is often presented in a way that is meant to make the listener feel personally implicated, personally responsible for the death of Jesus, because that sense of personal guilt is what motivates the conversion experience. Sermons say things like, "Your sins put him on that cross. Your rebellion nailed his hands." This is not considered unusual in evangelical Christianity. It is considered powerful preaching. The question then is whether the Panare translation was doing something fundamentally different, or whether it was doing the same thing that evangelical preachers do everywhere, just in a different language and a different cultural context. That is a much harder question to answer, and most people who share the viral story never even ask it. None of this means the missionaries were innocent of harm. Let us be clear about that. The New Tribes Mission's presence among the Panare, like its presence in dozens of other indigenous communities across South America, had real and lasting effects on the culture of the people they contacted. Traditional ceremonies were discouraged or abandoned. The Panare's own spiritual beliefs were reframed as false, dangerous, or demonic. Young people were educated in ways that pulled them away from their communities and their traditions. The rhythms of daily life were restructured around Christian practice. These things happened. they are documented. And they caused real pain and real loss that the Panare people have had to live with. The critique of missionary activity is valid. The problem is that the viral story does not stay at the level of a valid critique. It takes a genuine and serious concern and inflates it into a specific dramatic claim that may not be accurate. This matters for a reason that goes beyond the Panare. When a story becomes more dramatic than the truth, it actually does less work, not more. The real story of what missionary contact did to indigenous communities like the Panare is already disturbing enough to deserve serious attention. The loss of language diversity, the suppression of indigenous knowledge systems, the psychological effects of being told that everything your ancestors believed was wrong, these are profound harms. But when we replace that nuanced and important story with a simpler, more shocking story about missionaries literally rewriting the Bible to make a tribe believe they killed God, we turn a complex historical and ethical problem into something that sounds like a thriller movie. And thriller movie stories are easy to share and easy to forget. They do not build understanding. They build outrage, and then they fade. There is also something worth considering about the Panare people themselves in all of this. In the viral version of the story, they are almost entirely passive. They are the victims, the manipulated, the people to whom things are done. They have no agency. They simply believe what they are told because they are portrayed, implicitly, as too isolated and too naive to question it. This is its own kind of condescension. The real history of indigenous contact with missionaries is full of resistance, negotiation, adaptation, and selective adoption. Indigenous communities have never simply absorbed everything missionaries brought them. They have often taken pieces of what was offered and rejected others, incorporated new ideas into existing frameworks, and maintained aspects of their traditional culture in ways that outsiders did not always recognize or document. The Panare are not an exception to this. They have their own history of navigating outside contact on their own terms, and reducing them to helpless recipients of manipulation does them no justice. By now you might be asking yourself, so what actually happened? Here is the most honest answer available. Missionaries from the New Tribes Mission did make sustained contact with the Panare people in the 20th century. They did learn the Panare language, and they did translate Christian texts, including portions of the Bible, into that language. Those translations did use locally adapted language and imagery to make the Christian narrative feel immediate and relevant to Panare readers, which is standard evangelical translation practice. There is evidence that some of the translated material used inclusive or implicating language around the crucifixion narrative, as many Christian texts around the world do. There is no solid, verified evidence that the missionaries deliberately and systematically rewrote the story of Jesus' death to specifically blame the Panare people as an ethnic group, as a calculated strategy of guilt-based conversion. The dramatic version of the story, the one that says the Panare were told they personally killed Jesus, is an exaggeration of something more complicated, filtered through the perspective of a man who had his own reasons to tell it in the most dramatic terms possible. What does that leave us with? It leaves us with something that is both less dramatic and more important. It leaves us with the real story of what happens when one culture tries to enter another and reshape it in its own image, using the tools of language and meaning and belief. It leaves us with real questions about power, about consent, about who gets to decide what is true and what is sacred, and what is allowed to survive into the next generation. It leaves us with the Panare people, who are real and who are still here, and whose culture has been shaped and pressured and changed by contact with outsiders over many decades. And it leaves us with a lesson about how stories travel. The most shocking version of any story is the one that spreads. It is the version that gets shared on Twitter and cited in lectures and repeated in documentaries. The more accurate, more complicated version gets left behind because it does not move through the world as easily. It does not make people gasp. It makes people think, and thinking is slower than gasping. The story of the Panare and the missionaries is not unique in this way. History is full of stories that have been sharpened and simplified until they cut deeper than the truth, but also more narrowly. They hit hard, but they miss the larger picture. And the larger picture, in this case, is the ongoing and unresolved question of what societies owe to indigenous peoples who were contacted and changed without meaningful consent, whose languages and ceremonies and ways of knowing the world were treated as problems to be solved rather than treasures to be protected. That is a question worth sitting with. It does not have a simple answer. It does not resolve into a single villain or a single dramatic moment. It stretches across centuries and continents, and it is still unfolding today, in courtrooms and land disputes and language revitalization programs and communities like the Panares, where people are trying to hold on to who they are in a world that has never stopped trying to tell them who they should be instead. The next time you see a shocking story about history, about religion, about what one group of people did to another, do not just ask whether it is interesting. Ask whether it is true. Ask who is telling it and why. Ask what the simpler, less dramatic version looks like, and whether that version still matters. Because very often it does. Very often the truth, even when it is quieter than the story that replaced it, is the thing that actually changes how you see the world. The Panare did not need to be made into victims of a rewritten Bible for their story to matter. Their story already mattered. It always did. We just had to be willing to listen to the real version.